I grew up in a town called Plainville, Massachusetts. I sort of like floated in band for a couple of years. I saw
Floated in band.
well, let me start over. I basically, when I was in third grade, the high school jazz band visited, and the saxophonist in that band was the coolest thing I had ever seen in my entire life.
My guest today is Jeremy Udden, great saxophone player, wonderful friend. He came by, had so many wonderful, insightful things to say about the saxophone, sound, life as an artist, composing, staying above the things mentally. So much so that I had to break it up into 2 videos. So I hope you will stick around for both videos. You might notice a sudden scene change. It's only because I inadvertently deleted the audio. So I was happy to track him down and we did some more playing. His sound is so wonderful and his playing and lines are beautiful. So I hope you enjoy it. Hope you enjoy the video. Please like and subscribe, and thanks for dropping by.
Yeah, and it's luck because my folks lived in a town called Mansfield. They happened to move to Plainville. There's a lot of luck involved in how I ended up doing this because I'm not from a musical family at all. So, and Plainville happens to combine into a regional school because it's so small, and that school was called King Philip, and that just happened to have a very good music program. And so I kind of owe it all to that luck of finding Peter Levesque, and the band director's name was Peter Tileston, and they were both like really influential as a player and also just work ethic and things like that. I'm from like a super blue collar Boston Irish Catholic kind of zone family. So like no one listened to jazz. My uncle was into Elvis, and sorry, my grandfather was into Elvis, because even my grandparents are too young to be like big band generation. They're more like
Rock and
they're
rollers.
born in 30s, yeah. And my dad and my uncle were like Beatle maniacs. So there's definitely like a love of music that I saw how much they really connected with it, and that always affected me even later on, even in the records I still make. But jazz never would have entered my life if it wasn't for like the public school music program and these teachers I met,
Yeah, that's great.
I mean, Peter is he's one of these like monster players who lives in Boston. They're everywhere. I know you're from the Midwest. I mean, he's a legit, unbelievable alto player, and the sound of him playing in lessons at a softer volume is still an influence on the way I play. Like it was the first like real saxophone sound I ever heard in person with me. I never heard anything live before that. He had a huge sound, and when he blew into it, it would brighten up and he could get in kind of a Sanborn sort of a thing. But that like low level, when he was like playing soft in a lesson, and that airiness to it still formed like the basis of what I think of as a good alto sound.
So then you moved to undergrad. You went to NEC?
I did, yeah. I had decided to research the faculty, and I bought a George Garzone record. And if I'm not mistaken, I heard George live once in high school too, and that was really mind-blowing. So that alone, and I was in this like rock band, a ska punk band that was like, we started in high school, but we were starting to do well. We had made a second record, and we were starting to tour.
You didn't want to break the band up.
I didn't. Yeah, I still had it in my head that I was gonna like keep doing that, and I knew that would be over if I left too. So, but I couldn't be more happy that that's where I ended up, because the teachers changed my life forever.
Garzone, is that who you studied with when you?
Yeah, I studied with a lot of people. Like I feel super blessed because I stayed there for undergrad and grad. The main ones that Alan Chase I studied with right away. He's another like unsung hero, amazing alto player. Played with Rashid Ali, made these beautiful records as a leader with Matt Wilson. And he's this really cool player where he kind of has this maybe Desmond Konitz-ish thing, but then he'd go play in this band Prima Matera with Rashid, and he's just like, just total sound, And so he was like a real like big picture and small picture kind of teacher, So he had a big influence. Plus he was an alto player, and everyone else there,
He was a tenor player.
Yeah, Garzone was an enormous influence, probably my second biggest influence on sound, just the big furry Getz like sounds. And then his approach, his freeness, his chromaticism, his attitude, his mentality, his personality. He's just we would go hear the Fringe every week like it was going to church. My freshman year, I got tendonitis right away and had to actually quit playing after a month of school. And that shaped me a lot. But one thing that was good is second semester I started with Bergonzi, and I had barely played in 3 months. So I was in rough shape. And so I see that as a blessing too, because when I got to Bergonzi, we really started with very basic fundamental stuff. In some ways, like what got me into college was I was kind of really into sound in high school, and Pete Levesque gave me great fundamentals, and I was reading this Liebman book about overtones and long tones and stuff. And then I think I knew a diminished scale or something, and that got me in. And and I was obsessed with Desmond or whatever. But
well, hang on.
Okay.
You say like, you were in the All-American Grammy band in high school.
I was.
Come on.
I mean, yeah, but I'm convinced that the 18-year-old that was me back then probably wouldn't even get into NEC now, I think I chose the right things to work on. Again, maybe luck or maybe my instinct, but sound was always, for some reason, it was an obsession early on, really early. And so I think that really helped. And then knowing a few subs on a 5-chord made me sound like I knew a little more about what I was doing. But I really was reaching when I was doing that stuff. And so I was, by the time I got to Jerry, I was lucky to be sort of almost worse 6 months later, Before I got to Lacy, I think the other big influence was a man named Charlie Banacos. And he in Boston was sort of like a Lenny Tristano figure. He grew up with Bergonzi. They were buds their whole life. They grew up in Lowell. So it was really fascinating, by the time there was a period where I was studying with Garzone, Bergonzi, and Banacos at the same time. Banacos was the most structured, very thought out, worked out material that every week it would kind of expand to this point. And it's after a year I would just have to stop, and then I would restart. And I remember I a couple times restarted thinking we'd start on some new concept, because it'd be some super deep approach tones or pentatonic thing or whatever, and he'd be okay, so where'd we leave off, I'd be and then Bergonzi was kind of in between, where he was structured like Banacos, but the reason I always connected with Jerry was he is still playful with the material. This is something I took from him, is if you learn a pattern or a lick or a whatever, still use it. Be playful in how you use the material, rather than just use a metronome, play it, and then put it away and now go improvise. So keeping not his words, but someone else's, keeping practice as close to the act of improvisation as possible. Cool. And if you play with the material, you're more likely to use it, and it'll show up in your, I make the metaphor with students you read a book, then you write an essay on it or something. You're playing with the ideas in a more organic way. I've hung a lot with John McNeil. I never formally studied with him, but I've practiced with him a lot. And he's like that. And I think we can have this wrong impression of information players or something. But people like Jerry and McNeil, who are always learning new information. I've studied and played with, played with John a lot, studied with Jerry a lot, and they're true improvisers in the truest sense. John is always learning a lick is ear training. When John is working on something specific harmonically, he's singing constantly. He's trying to absorb it in a way that it'll only come out organically. It would usually be him directing things and being psyched on an idea. And we might play it, maybe using a Jamie Aebersold. He's got the whole library right there, CDs, or just duo with a metronome or whatever. And it'll be what if we try this? What if we just try to play lines and fourths? But again, it might sound like this super technical thing, but it would always involve a lot of singing and being playful with it. We would also just trade courses, singing and then playing, singing, playing. He was the first person to talk out, to name the notion to me of playing a line versus playing an idea. And he would the only time he would ever criticize is not the word, but he could kind of tell when I'm not playing by ear anymore, and sort of rifling off a line that connects changes, because, you and I, people like us know our approach tones and our scales or whatever, So there's an autopilot we can go on if we're not thinking. But his vibe is like he could kind of tell when my switch went off and I'm on autopilot, you know, and he'd be like, and that's when he'd be like, no, let's sing, like play ideas, you know, not lines, like really play by ear and yeah. So I think in his mind, it's a simple way of saying playing in a more mathematical way that you are aware of the chord changes, the arpeggios, the approach tones, and you're aware of how to connect chords. You know, these are skills we've learned. And then ultimately we learn these skills to transcend them and play by ear and play with honesty and authenticity. And I think John knows my playing well enough because we practiced a lot of hours together where he could kind of hear when my ears turned off for a second. You know what I mean? And he's got so much energy, like he's an older gentleman, but he's got, you know, like he can practice a long time, you know, and cool. So like mentally I might be waning or whatever. And he's like, no, come on, you know, you like kind of like, and so then like putting me on the spot and singing, we would like compose tunes together too. And yeah, I just learned so much from it. It made me think of information, or maybe it reminded me of just that notion that being playful, absorbing the material in a way that it'll come out in an authentic way. You know, we all say things, oh, I don't want to rifle off licks or all this stuff, you know what I mean? But guys like Jerry and John, I've seen like firsthand what that means. I kind of know something about what their material is, and then I hear them improvise, and I know they're just playing, which is always inspiring to see. And George too. Like those are people that I like know a lot about what goes into what they do, you know, because I got to see it firsthand. And then I see the final product too, and it's super inspiring. So Steve was fascinating because to me, he's 100% ideas. You know, I didn't know Steve Lacy's music until like sophomore year of college. Someone laid on me the record Evidence, which is the one with Don Cherry, and everybody should listen to that record. And he came, visited, gave a clinic before he was a teacher at NEC too.
Oh, he wasn't teaching there?
Not until, I didn't like study with him until I was a grad student there a little later on. But he had like visited during undergrad.
Did he live in the area or?
No, he lived in Paris, and then they moved to Boston for him to teach at NEC. That's Alan Chase orchestrated that. You know, that's so cool. It's amazing. And Alan deserves all the credit for that and the foresight. I mean, Steve changed NEC. Like I was at NEC long enough to see the culture change there from him and from Bob too, Bob Brookmeyer. I watched him turn every student, including myself, everyone started thinking of themselves as player composers and started like thinking about like, oh, what the hell is going to happen after school and when this ends and what am I going to do? Like Steve's like one of the great creating his own situations because he decided to play the soprano saxophone. It's almost like being a trombonist. There's fewer situations, you know, and there's a lot of great trombonists who are great writers, you know. So that was fascinating to see. Like he got me to take myself a little more seriously as a writer and everyone else. People started bringing originals to ensembles more. Steve is the only other faculty member, I think, that played in ensemble, you know. And by then we're talking like legend Steve Lacy, like. So when I did one of his ensembles and he had his horn out every time. Yeah, I mean, I remember bringing a tune in and hearing Steve play on my tune. Like, that was such a humbling, like, oh my gosh, like, I've created a context for which this person to play in, you know? Yeah, that was like a real moment, you know? And from him, he was like kind of all about fundamentals and practicing really simple things, which is mostly what I practice today. So like Steve has... You can see some of them in his book called Findings. He has some brilliant, simple exercises. You know, one's called Ain't She Sweet, one's called the Bugle Boy exercise. They're great, simple technical exercises to wake up the horn. He has an intervallic thing where he wrote out on a piece of paper every single possible interval on the saxophone, every combination of two notes on the saxophone, and then he cut it up, mixed it all up, and then put it out and rewrote it out, you know. So he has his, and that's his version of it is in Findings. He encourages you to do your own, but he was just sort of a meticulous explorer, you know. His thing isn't like, all right, now rip through those intervals. It's like pick one and play it for hours, sing it, go back and forth. And as a player, I mean, that's a guy who just seemed to march to his own drum completely. Like during the 50s, he was on the bridge practicing with Sonny Rollins. Like literally they used to play together on the actual bridge, you know. But somehow, you know, of course Steve has his little, like, occasionally he might sound like he's playing more conventional things, but I mean, his economy, the fact that it's like the currency he's using is not necessarily eighth notes, but almost more quarter notes. He's playing wider intervals than anybody really early on. His approach to Hmong tunes early on, just no one's doing that. I don't think it's appreciated enough, you know, like the way, you know, he has his Monk record and then Evidence, and then there's always a Monk tune on some early records in the 60s. And
he played with Monk, right?
He played with Monk only for about 4 months, but yeah,
okay.
He did play with him. Yeah. He also, Steve was an influence. Like he also like talked about finding your guys and digging into them as a way to find your own voice. Like in his case, it was Webern and Monk and Ellington, and kind of like wrapping him, like really diving deeply into those, you know, and that got me thinking about, well, what is that for me? Like what, you know, and what's that going to lead to? And
who would be your muses?
I mean, you know, probably the most obvious is Lee Konitz, but that's like a back and forth relationship for the whole time I've ever played the horn. You know, there'll be years where I'm not checking him out. You know, Desmond's in that mix or whatever. That's just like approach to saxophone stuff, like, you know, sonic approach. But then I started, like, maybe because of Steve, reconciling like, well, I actually grew up listening to the Beatles and I was born in 1978. I have a totally different, you know, so it got me like accepting that, you know, the rock music or folk or whatever, and that ended up changing the way I composed. It was like inspiring in a way to dig into that. So yeah, Bob, I was lucky enough to study with. I did not study composition with him. I showed him a couple of my tunes, like very meekly, and he had a few things to say about them. Actually, most of which were erasing material from them. That's one thing I remember from him. It was kind of cool. He was like, because I saw the freeness with which he took stuff away, and also just pointing out how important space was in music. And I saw him in clinics do this thing where he'd like tap on your back when you can play, and then when not, like just as a way to think about space as you're playing. I'm convinced that those who know that Bob is one of the great improvisers that jazz has ever produced. And I think he doesn't get the credit. I think he gets the credit more as a composer from where I sit. You know what I mean? He's celebrated as a composer, obviously not like Duke or someone like that, but like I wish he got more credit as, you know, he's every bit the improviser that Stan Getz was, or, you know, I think Lee Konitz. I'll say it. You know what I mean? Like, and I think it's a function of the fact that he played the valve trombone. That's my personal opinion, you know, where like people don't, you know, actually Alan said this super poignant thing about Rahsaan Roland Kirk, Alan, my teacher, Alan Chase, that I never forgot, where he said like, if Rahsaan did not do the crazy doubling thing, he'd be known as one of the great tenor players to ever live. And his tenor playing gets like almost overlooked because all people think of, you see the crazy pictures of him, right, and he's such a character or whatever. And I think similar with Bob, I mean, I don't know, you know, for what it's worth, my humble opinion, like if you played the tenor saxophone or the slide trombone, people might not overlook the brilliance of his improvisation. And he's also an example of someone who, as he aged, made brilliant records, super swinging, super chromatic playing that was influenced by modern players. And I just wish he was more celebrated as that. Because he had a huge influence on me. The duo record with Jim Hall.
At North Sea.
Yeah, the North Sea. Like, I mean, there's moments on that record where it's just Bob playing an eighth note line, and Jim is just doing these little accents, and the music is missing nothing. You do not need a drummer. You do not need a bass player. His time is so amazingly solid that it just fills anything music would ever need in that moment. It's just like, his lines are so deep, like, and I'd also say like he plays things that are so simple sometimes. Like there's a through line with some of my influences, like whether it's Lacy, Jimmy Giuffre, Bob Brookmeyer, you know, sometimes Konitz, where Bob will play something so simple, Desmond, that it's like it actually takes guts to play that simply. You know what I mean? To kind of like he could rip, he had vocabulary, but sometimes he plays some like real heartfelt, authentic diatonic melody that is almost like really hard to sell. But when you have the best sound and the best time in the world, you can do it. Like there's a through, and actually interesting enough, both Steve and Bob were really big on playing major scales super slowly. Both Steve and Bob were trying to get me to play louder, not necessarily to change my sound, but just to have confidence behind my ideas and just be like, damn it, that's the phrase, you know? And so in lessons with Bob, I'd come in armed with questions. I mean, what I wouldn't give to have like more moments with him now, because as the years passed, I know more and more about his discography, and I only knew what I knew back then, and it was pre-internet, and so it was just what was at Tower Records or whatever, so like I think about that often. And then we would play duo, and I would just, to think I got to experience that at that young age when like, I sucked basically, but I was cognizant enough to like say like, I'm just trying to feel his time, this is the truth right here. This is one of the greats. This guy played with Basie, this guy like direct line. So I want to.
Sure. Would you play a tune with me?
Sure, of course. I'd love to. Yeah.
Maybe before we play, like what are you playing?
So this is an alto saxophone. No, so at the moment I'm playing, and if we want to open this can of worms, I can explain. But this is a radio improved alto that I actually only got about 5 months ago. Selmer, yeah. Mario Scaramuza did the work. He's really awesome. He's in Brooklyn. I am playing a tenor saxophone mouthpiece on the alto right now, which is a whole thing. I don't know if you want to get into that now, but I can get there. Yeah, also, and this is partly your fault, Aaron. I think you told me one time that some of the classical guys would stack these.
Yeah.
Something to do with opening your throat and get maybe a darker sound, more flexibility.
Yeah, it does a thing.
A pivotal moment to me was one time I was trying mouthpieces in Rayburn Music, and Emilio Lyons was this like legendary repair guy, fixed like Stan Getz and Sonny Rollins horns. And I played him a couple mouthpieces. No one was in the shop. And I was like, what do you think? What difference here? And he goes, and he shrugs his shoulders. He's like, you guys all come in 2 weeks later and you sound the same anyway. So, so I think there's an element of like, none of this matters. And
yeah,
the brain hears a sound and it tries to help your body find it, Yeah. I say that, and I've changed my stuff so many times at this point, it's ridiculous. So,